The 2023-24 NHL season has finally come to a close. It was an epic playoffs that, in some ways, felt like it lasted forever, given the fact that the finals lasted until mid-June because of the historically long travel differences between the two teams in the finals. But really, it was a spectacular season filled with great storylines, the culmination of which was the Florida Panthers winning their first cup in franchise history in an epic 7-game showdown against the Edmonton Oilers. It was a championship that was a long time coming, almost to the point of being unbelievable for longtime fans, given the relative futility of the Panthers for the vast majority of their history. Needless to say, it was a long road to get here for the franchise that had had some legitimate uncertainty regarding their viability in South Florida. So, how did the Florida Panthers go from chumps to champs? We'll explore their journey in the inaugural edition of How They Built It, where we analyze some of the best teams in the NHL right now and see how they got where they are. In this series, we'll look at the background of the team in regards to how, in the last recent history, they constructed their roster and the context behind which they played in. And then we'll look at 3 aspects of team building: trading, drafting, and free agency. And through those 3 pillars, we will figure out how these teams have been successful and what, if anything, can be learned from their roster construction. The Florida Panthers entered the league in 1993 during a massive expansion wave for the NHL. With new commissioner Gary Bettman at the helm, the 1990s saw an explosion in hockey popularity south of the 49th parallel, and the league sought to take full advantage. The NHL had their sights set south, beyond the traditional range of Canada and the northeastern United States, where they had built their foundations. These were areas that were rich in population, but lacking in hockey fandom or tradition or heritage of the sport. The league started pushing hard into these non-traditional NHL markets, and the 1990s saw new teams pop up in Nashville, Tennessee, Dallas, Texas, Phoenix, Arizona, Atlanta, Georgia, Columbus, Ohio, and 2 teams in the state of Florida. The Tampa Bay Lightning, located, as the name suggests, in Tampa Bay, Florida, and the Florida Panthers, located in Sunrise, which is a suburb outside but nearby the metropolitan areas of Fort Lauderdale and Miami. Something that is important to note is that these 90s expansions are very different from the ones that fans that are more new to this sport might remember today. What I mean by this is that the teams that did expansions in the 1990s, the rules regarding the expansion draft were far more restrictive than those that were enjoyed by the likes of the Vegas Golden Knights and Seattle Kraken. Teams were able to protect former players, which meant that the pool of overall talent that these expansion teams had to choose from was, to put it nicely, pretty slim. Those early teams were typically bad, and I mean bad. The early San Jose Sharks, Tampa Bay Lightning, and Ottawa Senators, for example, had some of the worst seasons of all time when they entered the league due to the lack of major talent on their rosters. The Atlanta Thrashers and Columbus Blue Jackets have seemingly never really bounced back from these early expansion rosters. Atlanta basically was bad throughout the vast bulk of their history until their relocation to Winnipeg, and Columbus, while they've had a couple sporadic spurts of playoff appearances, have by and large been a team that has struggled to make the NHL postseason throughout their entire history. I bring this up because I want to illustrate how truly remarkable it was then that despite these early expansion troubles. Just 3 years into their existence, the Florida Panthers made the 1996 Stanley Cup Finals. It was the Cinderella run of all Cinderella runs. The team was just 2 years removed from selecting Ed Jovanovski first overall at the top of the draft, and were a team that had defied all expectations. Making the playoffs towards the bottom of the seeding in the East, they managed to take down the Boston Bruins, then the top-seeded Philadelphia Flyers, and the second-seeded Pittsburgh Penguins en route to the Stanley Cup Finals with a severely undermanned roster. It was in the finals that they would come up against the Colorado Avalanche, a team that were serious heavy hitters, with a roster containing many future Hall of Famers like Joe Sakic, Peter Forsberg, and Patrick Waugh. And needless to say, it was a real David versus Goliath matchup. Unfortunately for the Panthers faithful, the clock would strike midnight pretty early as the Cats were rather unceremoniously swept in the Stanley Cup Finals by the Avalanche in 4 games. This was obviously a painful loss for such a young franchise, but things really were looking nothing but up. And because of their early success, the Panthers at this time had some of the highest attendance numbers in the league and were the most popular sports team in the greater Miami area at the time. The next few years would see a number of high-profile trades, including one to bring in superstar Pavel Bure from Vancouver at the expense of Jovanovski. But despite these trades that would seemingly make their roster better, the Panthers suddenly couldn't gain any traction. After losing in the first round of the 1999-2000 playoffs, the Panthers would become a team consistently at the bottom of the league. And despite the advantageous weather and tax situation that continually allowed them to bring in free agents, they remained one of the worst teams in the league over the span of the next 2 decades. The Panthers went 12 years between playoff appearances, and it wouldn't be until a remarkable 26 years after their miracle run to the Stanley Cup Finals that they would win a playoff round in the 2022 playoffs. During that span, they became one of the least attended teams in the National Hockey League, leading to pervasive relocation rumors and much teasing by jaded traditional fans who felt that their existence and continued failure to attract fans was proof of hockey's inability to survive in the South. Most of the goodwill that they had built with more casual sports fans in Sunrise and beyond had dwindled. And beyond picking near the top of the NHL draft year after year, there were very few moments throughout the span of a traditional regular season that somebody who was thinking about cheering for the Florida Panthers might have any sort of excitement. This stung all the more while they had to watch their state neighbors in Tampa Bay have 2 different cup-winning eras despite starting as the far worse team, bringing Lord Stanley 3 times to the state of Florida while they alternated between mediocrity and the bottom of the basement of the league. This is the background through which the Florida Panthers found themselves coming into the modern day. So how, therefore, did we get from there, a team seemingly barely treading water that was almost entirely irrelevant from a competitive standpoint, to one which had back-to-back trips to the Stanley Cup Finals and ultimately ended up with them joining the elite club of teams that have forever had their names etched in hockey history? Well, let's look at the 3 mechanisms that teams have available to them to construct their rosters: the draft, free agency, and trades. As stated, the Florida Panthers were one of the worst teams in the league for a very long time, which naturally led to a lot of high draft picks. the Panthers selected close to the top of the draft for a very long time. Players that they have selected high in the draft within the past decade or so include Erik Gudbranson, 3rd overall in 2010, Jonathan Huberdeau, 3rd overall in 2011, Alexander Barkov, 2nd overall in 2013, Aaron Ekblad, 1st overall in 2014, and Owen Tippett, 10th overall in 2017. You'll notice two things looking at this list. One is that the Panthers have, at least in relatively recent times, drafted pretty well high in the draft, though this hasn't always been true throughout their history. And two, almost none of these players are Panthers as of this past season. Something that is interesting about the construction method of the Florida Panthers is the fact that the vast majority of their championship team was made up of players who were not originally drafted by the Panthers. This is something that is really unusual and flies in the face of conventional wisdom of team building, which is very draft-centric. But just because the Panthers don't currently have a lot of their own draft picks on their roster does not mean that their drafting hasn't played a role in their success. After all, many of the players that they drafted became valuable trading chips, which helped build their team. Players like Jonathan Huberdeau, Vincent Trocheck, Mackenzie Weegar, Devin Levi, Cole Schwindt, and Emil Heineman are all Florida Panther draft picks that have been traded for major pieces of the Cup-winning team. It is especially impressive that both Levi and Weegar were 7th round picks, and both look like they are going to be long-term impact players. Weegar, of course, has been and has had a great career as a D-man for the Panthers and the Flames, and Levi looks like he has star goalie potential for the Sabres. Not only have the Panthers found value in their drafting in trades, but the core pieces that they have locked down to long-term deals have been impactful players. None perhaps more so than their captain, Sasha Barkov, who for years has been a premier two-way forward in this league, one of the greatest dual threats of all time, and a great leader to boot. Their 1st overall pick in Aaron Ekblad has been a stalwart defender and a physical presence as well as having an underrated offensive game. And the recently extended Anton Lundell also shows great promise as a dual threat forward with a hell of a mentor in Barkov to help grow his game. There have been some notable misses in the 1st round as well from Florida recently. Henrik Borgstrom and Grigory Denisenko are both guys that stand out as not reaching potential, but really, there are always a handful of 1st round picks that don't make the expected jump every year, and by and large, the Panthers have drafted well, but traded even better. Speaking of trades, the Panthers are among the very best at it in the entire league. In recent years, the Panthers have had many key acquisitions via the trade market that have boosted their roster and ultimately led them to the cup-winning status that they enjoy today. The biggest thing that stands out for the Panthers' trade history is their depth and the value that they have been able to extract on the trade market, using draft picks, prospects, and roster players to make substantive improvements to their roster. Since the Panthers' competitive cycle began in 2020, they have become one of the most aggressive teams on the trade market and have made some substantial additions that have ultimately led them to build one of the deepest and most successful rosters of recent history. At the 2020 deadline, they made a move away from one of their longest tenured players in Vincent Trocheck, a player they drafted in the 3rd round and developed into a strong top 6 center, moving him to the Carolina Hurricanes for a 4-player package deal, including veteran forward Erik Haula and 3 younger players, Lucas Wallman, Chase Priskie, and Eetu Luostarinen. Haula was a solid player for the Panthers, but moved on in free agency. Wallman and Priskie did not ultimately amount to much, and both left the organization. But Luostarinen proved to be the real gem of the trade. The former second rounder has blossomed into an excellent defensive forward and was an integral part of the Panthers' bottom six and penalty kill. At the following deadline, during the pandemic-shortened 2021 season, the Panthers again made some huge swings. They traded a third-round pick to the Buffalo Sabres for defenseman Brandon Montour and a second-rounder and prospect Emil Heineman to the Calgary Flames for forward Sam Bennett. Both of these players were formerly highly regarded players. Montour, a second-round pick, and Bennett, the former fourth overall selection in the 2014 draft, but both players had struggled to live up to expectations, and both were in dire need of a change of scenery. The Panthers' pro-scouting staff clearly believed that they could get more out of these players, and they were absolutely correct. Under a new system, Montour blossomed into an elite two-way defenseman, putting up a career-best 73-point season in 2022-23, while Bennett has become the dominant physical power forward that the Flames always believed he could be, putting together 40-plus point campaigns in each of his 3 full seasons with the Cats. Thanks to the Panthers, Montour just became one of the highest paid defensemen in the league, signing a 7-year deal in Seattle for over $7 million, while Bennett has completely rejuvenated his career with the Panthers and was a key reason why their team was so deep offensively. That summer, the Panthers decided to target yet another formerly highly touted prospect in need of a change of scenery in Sam Reinhart, the second overall pick from 2014, trading goalie prospect Devin Levi and a first-round pick to the Sabres in exchange for the talented forward. Much like the previous 2 examples, Reinhart blossomed in Florida and severely increased his point totals in each of his 3 seasons in South Florida, including a career-high 57 goals and 94 points this past season, as well as being a major contributor offensively in the playoffs. Reinhart will be sticking around in Florida, taking a team-friendly 8-year deal for under $9 million a season. We can see that the Panthers clearly have a pattern of identifying players that, for some reason or another, aren't currently a fit on their previous teams, and then using their coaching and development to get the best out of these players. Perhaps no one trade is more clear example of the Panthers' philosophy than Matthew Tkachuk. In the 2022 offseason, after contract negotiations broke down between the Calgary Flames and Matthew Tkachuk, the young forward made it known that he was not interested in re-signing in Calgary and formally requested a trade. Now, the Panthers did have an advantage here. From the beginning, Tkachuk, who was at RFA, made it known that he wanted to go to specific US-based markets, of which Florida was on the list. But the asking price was still sky high, and rightfully so for a 26-year-old 6th overall pick that was coming off of a 104-point season. So, the Panthers chose to be bold in their pursuit of Tkachuk and ultimately offered a very large package consisting of Jonathan Huberdeau, Mackenzie Weegar, prospect Cole Schwindt, and a first-round pick. This was a massively risky trade for the Panthers. Huberdeau and Weegar were established veterans that had spent their entire careers in Florida, with Huberdeau blossoming as a former 3rd overall pick into an elite playmaking winger who was the Panthers' MVP his last season in Florida, scoring a career-high 115 points, and Weegar going from a 7th round project to a bona fide top 4 D-man with huge offensive upside. Still, the upside of Tkachuk was too great for the Panthers to pass up on, and so they parted ways with 2 longtime franchise pieces to make the trade, and then locked Tkachuk down to an 8-year, $9.5 million contract before he had even played a single game for the Panthers. This would prove a pivotal trade for Florida. Huberdeau struggled mightily in Calgary, while Tkachuk continued his elite offensive output. More than that, though, Tkachuk's blend of potent offense and in-your-face physicality came to symbolize, perhaps more than any other player, the ride-the-line, hard-to-play-against style of the Florida Panthers that would make them successful in the postseason. Florida in general has made some major swing to the fences type players and aggressive style trades, and these trades have paid dividends several times over for the Cats. While this strategy isn't always successful, for example, their work at the 2022 deadline, giving up 2 first-round picks and Owen Tippett in trades for Claude Giroux and Ben Sherratt, more often than not, the Panthers have found themselves on the winning end of a trade when they make them. It is often said that the best teams on NHL free agency day are the ones who largely avoid it entirely, and there's reason for this saying. There are so many examples of players who were signed on to bloated contracts on July 1st, which quickly aged poorly, to the point of either being a hindrance on the team's salary cap or needing to be bought out or dumped along with valuable assets. The reason for this, I think, is pretty simple. Free agency is a time when every single NHL team has the chance to bid on the services of a player, which means that in order to get a guy signed that you really want, typically you have to outbid other teams, which means you need to offer a lot of money, a lot of years, or both. And given the fact that most free agents are in their late 20s or 30s, which is typically a time when players begin to start declining in their overall production and ability, and you have a recipe for disaster. The Panthers, for the most part, have stuck to this rule, with one notable exception. The Panthers have made, by and large, reasonable bets in free agency, relying on a seeming belief much like their trading philosophy of using their pro scouting ability to identify players whom they feel they can get the best out of. 2 such examples of this are Evan Rodriguez and Carter Verhaeghe, guys that were valuable contributors to other teams, but were not so established that they commanded the types of deals that typically teams regret on July 1st. And they were obviously both players that the Panthers felt they could get the best out of, which they definitely did, as both have been instant fits in the Panthers lineup. The Panthers have also made hay targeting formerly highly rated players that were bought out from the previous teams, like in the case of Oliver Ekman-Larsson, who rehabbed his game in Florida to great success and are hoping to do the same thing recently with the likes of Nate Schmidt and Adam Boqvist. There are no better examples, perhaps, of the Panthers' superior pro scouting and development, however, than the case of Gustav Forsling. This was a guy who bounced through multiple organizations, traded from Vancouver to Chicago, then from Chicago to Carolina, and then claimed off waivers by the Panthers. A former 5th-round pick, Forsling showed potential but had never able to elevate his game to the NHL level until he arrived in Sunrise. With Florida, Forsling has blossomed into one of the best two-way defenders in the entire NHL, and one of the greatest waiver-claimed players ever, signing an 8-year deal worth over $7 million per season to play with the Panthers for the long term. Now, this obviously isn't a free agency pickup, but I feel that waivers is similar enough to free agency that it sort of falls in the same category, especially because it relies on the same type of staff, the pro scouting staff, who identify players that would be a good fit for the team. As I mentioned previously, there is one major exception to the general rule for Florida of being more conservative when it comes to their spending on July 1st. The one major exception to their free agency rule has been in goal. In 2019, the Panthers signed Sergei Bobrovsky to a whopping 7-year, $10 million per season deal. making him the highest paid player on the Panthers roster and one of the highest paid goaltenders in the history of the NHL. This was a contract with tremendous amount of risk from the moment it was signed. Bobrovsky was known as a stellar goaltender when he was on his game. His 2 Vezina trophies before he got to Florida are certainly a testament to that. However, Bobrovsky also had built the reputation as someone that was wildly inconsistent year after year. So giving this kind of monetary commitment to him was risky, to say the least. Those trends would mostly prove accurate. Bobrovsky struggled mightily in his first few seasons as a Panther. In his second season, he ended up losing his net to Chris Driedger, and his performance had dipped so much that the Panthers ended up using a first-round pick to select a goaltender in Spencer Knight, whom they clearly viewed as the heir apparent to Bobrovsky in net. I remember in those first few years, there were openly rumors that the Panthers were looking to potentially move on from Bobrovsky, but his contract rendered that virtually impossible. Forced to remain committed to Bob, their patience did eventually pay off, as Bobrovsky once again, as he has throughout his career, rebounded, and he returned to form. This playoffs, we saw the perfect microcosm of the type of player that Bobrovsky is and has been throughout his whole career. The nearly unbeatable juggernaut in net that carried the Panthers through the first 3 rounds of the playoffs into a commanding 3-0 series lead in the finals, and the shaky, uncertain Bobrovsky, who had a sub-800 save percentage in games 4, 5, and 6, where the Panthers almost became the first team in decades to be reverse swept in the Stanley Cup Finals. Ultimately, while there have been plenty of ups and downs with Bobrovsky in Florida, at the end of the day, there are now pictures of Bobrovsky lifting the cup in a Panthers jersey, which is really the best you can ask for of any player acquisition. Almost certainly, Bobrovsky will play out the remainder of his contract, at which point he'll be in his late 30s. But obviously for the Panthers, this was their biggest gamble, certainly their biggest risk, and it many times looked to be their biggest weakness. But it's hard to argue that that gamble didn't ultimately pay off, given the fact that Bobrovsky did get them to the promised land, even though it took some bumps in the road to get there. So, how have the Panthers been so successful? In a word, scouting, specifically pro scouting. The Panthers have been exceptionally talented at identifying players who will fit their system and been extremely aggressive in their pursuit of them. Through trading and free agency, the Panthers have identified players that are undervalued throughout the NHL, and with exceptional coaching, have been able to get these players to buy into their relentless, hard-nosed two-way system. Of course, it does need to be said that the Panthers have a clear advantage over many teams from a recruiting standpoint. With low taxes, little media pressure, and weather that most people find agreeable, the Panthers have never had a particularly difficult time getting players to agree to play for them, even when they were a consistent basement team. Even with that being said though, the Panthers clearly have evolved from where they were in those dark days. And the fact is that they are very deliberate in the kinds of players that they are targeting. And by knowing the type of game that they want to play, they have been able to have great success. The best teams in the league seemingly know their identity and are consistent on all aspects of team building in acquiring players that fit this mold of their chosen identity. It will be fascinating to see how the Panthers are able to operate moving forward after losing some key pieces, especially on D in the offseason. But I anticipate that this team should at the very least be a top contender in the Eastern Conference for at least a few more seasons to come.